Welcome to Metaviews from Metavate Consulting. What is the evidence for Bacopa for cognition and memory?
Hello, everybody. My name is Professor Stough, and I'm here today with Professor Andrew Scholey. We're from Metavate Consulting, and we'll be talking today about Bacopa monnieri, which is a subject very close to my heart. And I've conducted quite a bit of research on Bacopa. Some people refer to Bacopa as brahmi. It's an Indian herb that's traditionally grown, is grown in the wetlands of India, but it grows right around the world. It's one of the oldest known herbal medicines, dating back 4000 BC in Indian scriptures. And is traditionally being used for a wide variety of health benefits, including things like pain, epilepsy, behavioural issues in children, and most importantly for us at Metavate, for cognition and specifically for memory in terms of traditional use. What's really interesting about various extracts of Bacopa or brahmi is that there's a huge amount of preclinical and animal research work on Bacopa that have really confirmed the historical use and have started to provide some of the mechanisms of action of Bacopa. Some of these mechanisms are things like changes to the inflammatory system and markers, oxidative stress, some studies looking at beta amyloid, changes in brain connectivity, amongst a wide range of other biological processes. So this is a really exciting and interesting area to talk about in the context of cognition. Andrew, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Con. I agree. I think probably this is an extract that I first encountered before we'd even met, actually, when we were reviewing each other's papers, probably. And I remember coming across some of your early work on Bacopa, probably around 2000 or maybe that kind of date. And
it's a long time ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And at the time, it wasn't an extract that I was particularly familiar with. And obviously, you've done a huge amount of work in this field. And my take on it, I guess, is that it's certainly one of the extracts with the most, with the highest level of evidence for efficacy in improving memory and reducing anxiety. And yeah, in particular, I think it's really consistent. It's not quite unique, but it's quite rare that there's something where the results are so consistent over trials. How did you first get into this field or look at this particular extract?
It's quite a complex story, actually. I don't think we have enough time to go through it, but we had just finished a large study looking at the effect of EGB761 or ginkgo extract on cognition. And the people in Australia who had been selling Bacopa wanted to establish some evidence from human clinical trials in healthy people. So they approached us, and we conducted the first randomized controlled clinical trial in healthy humans on Bacopa in around about 2000. You're right, it's a long time ago. And that was with the extract called CRDRI 08, which has basically come out of about 50 years of in vitro and animal research sponsored by the Indian government in some of their medical research laboratories. So, we progressed to the clinical phases because we knew a lot about that particular extract. I mean, there are other extracts, and some of them have also shown to be efficacious for cognition, but I think the CRDRI 08 one is the most researched.
Can you tell us about that the very initial trials that you did, and maybe how they've developed into bigger trials over the years?
Yeah, sure. So it was almost a proof of concept, the first one. I think it was published in Psychopharmacology. It was around only 50 healthy humans across the, different ages, randomized to, excuse me, to either placebo condition or the CDRI 08 Bacopa. And they consumed it for 3 months. And we measured cognition using sort of standardized neuropsychological tests at baseline, I think 1, 2, and 3 months. And we found actually there was an improvement in memory and also processing speed. And they're the two domains that are associated with cognitive aging specifically. And so those benefits were seen in the Bacopa group compared to the placebo group. So that was, the first trial, and that was replicated by another university in Australia, a different part of Australia, using the same extract, same tests pretty well. As you say, incredibly consistent finding. And then there were some other replications of the same and different extracts in different parts of the world, Asia, in the US. And then in 2008, we published a larger study with about 100 participants randomized to CDRI 08 or placebo for 3 months. And we've also found that there was an improvement in memory using different tests this time. This time we use more computerized tests, so we're looking for slightly different outcomes. And some of these studies, we also see a change in anxiety as well, which is interesting. And that's about half the number of trials report this improvement in mood associated with cognition. And then, as you know, Andrew, we started this huge trial, which we've just finished, called CRDRI. And I think we'll have a separate white paper and a separate video about CRDRI.
Possibly more than one.
Yeah, possibly. And we haven't looked at the data there, but that's been a 12-month intervention with CDRI 08 with a stack of amazing biological and psychological outcomes. And then we also published a paper, one of my PhD students, Grace McPhee, looked at combining CDRI 08 with cognitive training and neuroimaging in the elderly. And she found that that those who consumed CDRI 08 and Bacopa versus placebo had what we call more synaptogenesis, so more connections, particularly in sort of the grey cells of the brain associated with cognition than those who did the cognitive training but took placebo, which is really interesting.
What you talked a little bit about some of the mechanisms, and I think it's quite typical of a lot of these botanical extracts that they have many different, that they affect many different processes. They're sort of polypharmacological, I guess. Do you have any sort of hunches as to which mechanisms are mainly responsible for these effects on memory, and maybe are they the same or different to the ones on anxiety?
Yeah, that's a good question. We've prepared a white paper on this topic actually, so that's currently available on the Metaviews website. It talks about the different ingredients associated with Bacopa monnieri extracts. So, as you say, they're polymechanistic, much like many herbal extracts. For Bacopa, we think the saponins are the most important component. Saponins are sort of a class of substances, and within that are what we call bacosides. And the bacosides are fairly unique to Bacopa. And so we think that they have a pretty significant role. But there are other antioxidants and a range of other molecules in the Bacopa extracts that we're using. And so they're the ones that we think are causing the mechanistic effects. And we're pretty focused on looking at some of the inflammatory processes associated with Bacopa. Has very strong effects on the interleukin system, particularly IL-1, particularly IL-6, IL-10, and a few other inflammatory markers, which we think are associated with changes in brain function, cognition, particularly for elderly people where we're seeing these chronic effects. So there's a lot more to be studied. There's some animal studies that have also shown changes in beta amyloid, reduction in heavy metals, antioxidant effects are quite powerful as well. So we're still looking at some of these mechanisms, but there's many, which is quite exciting, I think, for a substance for people to take.
That's really interesting. You've talked a lot, your trials have been mainly chronic, looking at, you're talking about 3 months and now 12-month trial. And I must say it's pretty unusual to push out the intervention for that length of time. So really looking forward to seeing those data. Yeah. What about acute effects?
We're excited for those studies. Well, I really should ask you about the acute studies because you know, in our shared centre, you've been focusing on acute assessment of nutraceuticals for cognition. And I know you've published a couple of papers with CRDRI 08 looking at acute effects, and you really have to use a different type of methodology to look at acute effects, don't you?
I think in general, not always, but often the acute effects really emerge when you work people's cognitive processes a bit harder. So one approach that we've taken with this is something called the cognitive demand battery, which I think we also talked about in our Metaview on cocoa flavanols, which is also available on the Metaviews website. Both a video and another white paper. And yes, so the cognitive demand battery involves really hammering cognitive processes. So people undergo a series of quite demanding cognitive tasks, a little cycle which takes about 10 minutes, but they go through this usually 6 times over the course of an hour. What you can see is people's performance going down and their self-rated mental fatigue going up. And with this particular extract of Bacopa, as with a few other phytochemical botanical extracts, what we found was that during certain periods of this 1 hour cognitive demand, that we improved cognitive function. So that's one way of doing it. The other way is trying to capture the effects of increasing mental workload using something which many people will be familiar with, which is multitasking. So this is an instrument that was developed by our colleague in the UK, Mark Weatherall, where individuals sit in front of a computer and there are 4 tasks in quadrants which they have to perform simultaneously. And usually we have one of our sternest research assistants standing next to them with a clipboard to increase kind of workload stress that's involved. And although we can measure performance on the individual task, what's more interesting in many ways is the way in which performing the test affects mood and some physiological outcomes. So in the case of Bacopa, there were some hints that it protected against the increase in stress and anxiety that occurs when people engage in that multitasking. But perhaps the most striking result was that it actually protected against the increase in the stress hormone cortisol, which is associated with performing this particular multitasking battery. So that again hints at another mechanism, along with the inflammation and some other of the neurochemical properties that we know Bacopa has. So it is interesting that some of these botanicals seem to have evolved with this kind of little cocktail of properties that mean that they can improve mood and cognitive function. So we have, I think the evidence for the acute effects is probably not as strong, only in that there's much less research looking at acute effects. I guess just to sort of think about the future, do you have any plans to take this further once you've got the results of the ARCLI study?
Well, there's lots of research to be done. I think, recently there was a little bit of press about a new drug that was passed by the FDA that removes beta amyloid, and the data for that is particularly weak, I think. I think we're all desperate for new pharmaceuticals for dementia, but I think CRDRI is, a fantastic proposes us with an incredible opportunity to do clinical trials in dementia. Perhaps maybe not late stage dementia, but maybe earlier stage dementia where there's some protective mechanisms in play, but potentially with the anti-inflammatory properties, the beta amyloid properties, and some of the other properties which we know are related to cognition could be particularly useful in that space. We've already done some preliminary studies with children with ADHD and CRDRI-08. So there's really some great opportunities there. I think given its profile of properties, if you're developing a new nutraceutical, it really could slot in there with some other products that had different mechanisms, potentially to be a great cognitive enhancing nutraceutical. I was just going to ask you about because I know that one of your students published a paper on the effect size of Bacopa.
Yeah, that's right. That was, we can't always get funding for the sort of trials that we want to use. So, what we would have loved to do is look at what we would love to do is do a so-called head-to-head trial where we would look at something like Bacopa and compare it to one of the pharmaceutical treatments for something like dementia, maybe one of the cholinesterase inhibitors. In this case, we looked at this, we were quite interested in looking at the effects compared to a drug called modafinil, which is a kind of, it's actually should only be prescribed for narcolepsy or profound daytime sleepiness, but people use it off label as a cognitive enhancer, and there is some research out there on using it as a cognitive enhancer. So what Chris Neal did, the student we're talking about, he
Dr. Chris Neal.
Pardon?
Dr. Chris Neal.
Dr. Chris Neal now, yes. He so Chris looked at the literature and worked out the effect sizes, which is a standardized measure of, you can compare two means, but you need to standardize that depending on what exactly you're looking at. So he looked at the effect sizes from Bacopa and actually ginseng, and also from modafinil, and just compared them. And actually what he found was that the biggest effect sizes from Bacopa and also ginseng were actually higher than the effect size from modafinil, this drug that many people are taking as a cognitive enhancer. So so I think it just goes to show that that a lot of these botanicals actually can have more profound effects on cognition than some mainstream or so-called, I guess we could call them classical pharmaceuticals, if you like.
Yeah, and potentially safer as well. And
absolutely, I was going to ask you about that actually. Yeah. One of the things about this new Alzheimer's drug, which is, I think it's just been given the green light by the FDA in the last week or so, is the side effect profile. So I think 40% of people on the trial who took the new Biogen drug were either had sort of brain bleeds or swelling on their MRIs. What about Bacopa? What's the What's the side effect profile like?
Well, it's extremely good. I mean, the only side effects, sometimes you get a few gastrointestinal issues, which tend to subside pretty quickly. But, you know, it's an over-the-counter medicine. It's been used in hundreds of countries and for, as I said before, thousands of years. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a very well tolerated and safe herbal medicine.
So I guess effectively we've got centuries, millennia of kind of field studies which attest to the fact that it's not toxic. And I do wonder if maybe you know, that's pretty typical of botanical extracts and bioactives. I wonder if that might be a feature of extracts which have lots of different properties rather than just really you know, hammering a single, say, neurotransmitter system, that they're just having quite gentle or less.
Yeah, it's possible. I think, you know, if there was some profound danger of these extracts, we would have picked them up by now. I think these are, you know, really quite safe molecules. So, and look, it doesn't really surprise me that there's so many trials showing positive efficacy and safety for particularly CRDRI, right? Because there's hundreds and hundreds of studies and on this substance. It's incredibly well studied and published. And we just, you know, the sophistication of this area is fairly unique in this sort of nutraceutical space, I think. So, yeah, it's really, really exciting.
So, one last question is, I believe, I'm not sure if this is right, but I came across a stamp that had Bacopa on it from India. Do you know anything about that?
Yes, yeah. It's a big deal in India, Bacopa. Yeah, they have stamps. This particular extract that we use, CRDRI 08, was actually launched by the Indian Prime Minister in I think it's 1996, after 50 years of dedicated government research. And the Indian government first chemically, I think, identified the molecular structure of some of the bacosides and Bacopa in general in 1946. So yeah, so look, it's a big deal in India. Lots of medical studies on this topic, and it doesn't surprise me that we now have quite sophisticated extracts like CRDRI 08 that we can use across the world.
Fantastic.
All right, well, we might sign off. So that's another Metaview. Please visit our website to see some of the other Metaviews and some of the white papers. And if you've got any suggestions for other topics we can talk about, please contact us. Thanks, Andrew.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you for your attention. For more information, visit metavate.consulting.